Good morning, I'm Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Today, we're talking about diabetes. In fact, we're dedicating a whole episode to the concerns about this growing epidemic. You know, it may surprise you to hear that researchers say half of Americans, all Americans, will either be pre-diabetic or diabetic by 2020. It's an illness that affects almost all of us in some way. In fact, chances are, as you're watching right now, you may know someone who has a form of diabetes. So why is this illness at epidemic proportions, especially here in the United States? And how can we as a nation start to fight this deadly condition? That's where we're going today. Let's get started. Now, health officials say diabetes could become the epidemic of the 21st century. Think about that. Studies say, again, if we in the United States keep living sedentary lifestyles with poor diets, hardly any exercise, then half of all Americans will either be pre-diabetic or have diabetes by the year 2020. That is less than 10 years from now. Just take a look at this map from the CDC. Take a look at those dark blue areas, especially in the southeast, the Appalachian states, and parts of the southwest. Those are areas that have the highest number of diabetes cases. We show you this because we want you to look at this map now that shows the highest levels of obesity. They're pretty much the same areas. So what does obesity have to do with diabetes? Well, in order to answer that question, we need to look at what causes the illness in the first place. Diabetes is caused when there is too much glucose or sugar in the body. Now, we of course get sugar from the things that we eat, and the body is designed to process sugar so it can enter our cells and provide us with energy. But glucose can't enter our cells without insulin. That's a hormone, and it's produced by the pancreas. Now, if you have diabetes, your body isn't making any or is not making enough insulin, or it can't properly use the insulin it is producing. As a result, you get too much sugar, stays in the blood, and if this occurs over a long period of time, it can lead to serious medical problems. Now, there are two main types of diabetes. People call them type 1 and type 2. Now, type 1 diabetes used to be known as juvenile diabetes because it was usually diagnosed in children and young adults. Roughly about 5 to 10% of all people with diabetes have this type, which is not reversible because their pancreas is simply not producing enough insulin. The remainder have type 2 diabetes. And for these people, their body can no longer process insulin correctly. That's the way to think about it. Some people with type 2 have a genetic predisposition for it, but the majority develop the condition because they're overweight. People who carry excess weight, especially in their midsection, are more likely to develop type 2 diabetes because the fat in their tissues causes an imbalance of insulin in the body. The condition is also called insulin resistance. And some minority groups, such as African Americans, Hispanics, certain Asian Americans, have a higher risk of developing diabetes type 2. Now, because of the way their bodies store fat and their genetic makeup, it sort of puts them at this increased risk. But the good news is this. In some cases, with diet and exercise, and that alone, type 2 diabetes is reversible. Not everyone can do it, and some of them may need the help of medications as well. It all depends on your willingness in some ways to make some drastic changes. This is the story of two men. Both are successful, active, have families, and both have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Robert Howard Sr. grew up surrounded by diabetics. His parents had diabetes. His siblings had it. But when he was told he had type 2 diabetes in 1996, he was in denial.
I was really shocked. I kind of didn't believe it, all those in my family, because I was kind of asymptomatic. I hadn't had any symptoms.
It took Howard almost a year to go to a diabetes specialist because he didn't want to conform to the lifestyle.
Diabetes, I mean, that's a headache. I mean, you have to control your diet and so much stuff.
Jonathan Legg's father died of a heart attack in his 40s, so he was always watching his health. Although he had gained some weight after college, he was still active. 2 years ago, Legg was in his late 30s when he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. It opened his eyes.
It was a big wake-up call, more than anything, that wasn't what I was doing, and what my current weight was not okay.
The doctor wanted to put him on medications, but Legg said he'd rather try and turn his diabetes around with diet and exercise.
I wanted to know that the changes I was making were making a difference, and it wasn't the drug.
Now, both Robert and Jonathan got their diabetes under control. In fact, one of them reversed it altogether. We're going to show you how they did it. Their tricks, so to speak. That's later in the show. And next, you've heard the statistics, and they are staggering. So what is causing the number of diabetes cases in the United States to skyrocket? Could it simply be that we're becoming a heavier nation? I'm going to sit down and talk to a leading expert on obesity about how we can help the next generation. That's next. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, almost 26 million children and adults have diabetes. Approximately 79 million, or 1/3 of adults, are pre-diabetic. And 1.9 million new cases of diabetes were diagnosed in people over the age of 20 last year alone. The numbers are pretty hard to digest, pretty staggering. So today, to help us, we have Dr. Gary Foster. He's director of the Center for Obesity Research and Education at Temple University in Philadelphia. He's also a former president of the Obesity Society. Welcome to the program, Doctor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
These numbers are staggering. I mean, people have paid a lot of attention to the fact that they say 1/3 of Americans may have diabetes by the year 2050. People seem to understand diabetes or know about it at least somewhat. What's going on here? Why do you think these numbers are just expected to continue increasing?
I think what's behind this is the epidemic of obesity. They're often called twin epidemics of both diabetes and obesity. And we know that excess body weight adversely affects every organ system in the body. So it shouldn't be surprising that as obesity increases, as it has over the last 30 years, that medical conditions, especially conditions like type 2 diabetes, will also increase.
This is the sort of work that you do. And, you know, as a television person who's a doctor, I talk about this issue all the time. People seem to intuitively understand obesity and what causes it, and that it's really problematic. Why don't people seem to act on that? Why isn't the message seem to get through?
I think the message does get through, but I think there's a big disconnect between knowing something, much like people can know it's not good for you not to wear a seatbelt, it's not good for you to smoke, it's not good for you to not exercise. These are really tough behavioral things, especially on the eating and activity side. So we're placed in an environment where we ask our patients to swim upstream chronically. So there's lots of bombardment to eat more and to move less, and we're asking them to do just the opposite. So it's a lot harder than it seems.
Have you come across things that work? And what seems to actually make an impact?
I think what makes an impact is to first start with children, and because that's what's going to drive the future generations of diabetes. And as you well know, there are now childhood cases of so-called adult diabetes or type 2 diabetes. And I think when it comes to childhood obesity, there's 3 things that you can focus in on, and this would be, I think, generally relevant to adults as well. One is to decrease portion size. We have a portion distortion going on in this country about what's an appropriate portion to consume. So that would be one thing. And I think simplicity counts here. Worry less about fat, fiber, carbohydrates, protein, and whatever you're eating, eat a little bit less of that. Operationalize it as about 1/3 less, 1/4 less, and make that small change. Second, spend less time in front of screens, whether it's watching DVDs, computer games, TV. That will make a big difference. And then the third factor would be to decrease the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. We as a country drink too many calories, and if we can get children especially to focus on water and skim milk, it would make a big difference.
I worry about diabetes just because of the genetic likelihood. By the way, really quickly, you said type 1 versus type 2. Type 1 used to be considered juvenile or kids because of genetic causes, and type 2 because of lifestyle changes. But we're seeing kids develop diabetes that was traditionally associated with lifestyle changes, too much weight. What is the misconception? Is there a misconception about diabetes? People always say to me, if you eat a lot of sugar, you're going to get diabetes. Perhaps, but that's because of obesity, right? What are other misconceptions about diabetes?
I think that's a major misconception. Look, when it comes down to obesity, it's consuming more calories than your body burns. And obesity, independent of how you got there, whether you ate too much sugar, too much fat, too much carbohydrate, too much protein, it's obesity that leads to the consequences of type 2 diabetes. Actually, developing type 2 diabetes, obesity leads to developing type 2 diabetes, and from type 2 diabetes, consequences will happen. You're right that type 2 diabetes certainly has genetic components, but the increase has to result from lifestyle factors. And what we're seeing is that the lifestyle factors that used to not bear its fruit, so to speak, until the 40s or 50s of an adult lifespan is now happening in teenage years. It's really troubling for what's both the individual consequences for the children who suffer from this, but the economic consequences of type 2 diabetes for our country.
There are foods out there that are obviously worse for you, and they're plentiful, especially in urban locations. What do you do about that? It's easy to get unhealthy food, doctors. I guess what I'm saying, it's cheap, It's easily accessible. What should be done about that?
There's an impending national menu labeling law, which I think will help. It will put in chain restaurants what are the calories of the foods that people are buying at the point of purchase. That could be a big help. I think that we could do a better job in city planning of making it easier, again, not making it hard for people to swim upstream all the time, to make it easier to bike, make it easier to walk. Taxes has certainly been considered on certain foods. I'm not sure there's the political will to do that, but a smoking precedent would suggest that that may decrease the consumption of some unhealthy foods.
Well, we got 40 years before the staggering number takes effect, and hopefully some of those things, at least making our cities more healthy, will make a difference in that time period. Doctor, thanks so much for being on the program.
My pleasure.